When looking at shipwrecks, there are some famous names that get surprisingly little coverage. Perhaps the most notable of these is the wreck of Admiral Graf Spee. This wreck, arguably the most famous of Germany's Panzerschiff, is barely covered at all, in spite of sinking in shallow water not that far off a major port. Graf Spee's story is well known. Her wreck, however, has largely vanished from history, some salvage operations, mostly done 20 years ago, aside. Certainly there's a lack of pictures of the wreck after the 1940s. As such, this video will mostly focus on pictures of the wreck taken at the time, and will be fairly short as a result, more in line with a shorter version of the Tirpitz video than something like Indianapolis. Let's begin with a brief overview of how Graf Spee ended up a wreck in South America. That story began in late August of 1939. Graf Spee left Germany on August 21st, bound for the South Atlantic. War was soon to begin, and this ship was one of several German raiders sent out in preparation for the conflict. When war did come, Graf Spee spent late September through early December on raiding. The ship menaced the South Atlantic and Indian Ocean around Madagascar. The sinking of multiple merchant ships got British attention, prompting them to hunt the ship down. This ultimately led to the Battle of the River Plate off the coast of Uruguay on December 13, 1939. Graf Spee fought a running battle with 3 British cruisers, Exeter, Ajax, and Achilles. The damage that Spee suffered was fairly minimal, for the most part. However, there were a couple exceptions. Her desalination plant was wrecked, for example. More critically, her fuel systems were damaged. Graf Spee was limited to about 16 hours of sailing, unless that damage was repaired. Nowhere near enough to return home. Furthermore, the British played a massive game of naval chicken. They did everything they could to convince the Germans that there were more ships nearby than there actually were. The result is probably to be expected. After spending some time in Montevideo Harbor for repair work, Spee's captain made his decision. Hans Langsdorff, aware of the risk of internment, chose to scuttle his ship. On December 17, 1939, Graf Spee set sail. A crowd of 20,000 onlookers watched, expecting a continuation of the battle. Instead, a skeleton crew was taken off the ship, and Graf Spee, abandoned and alone, was engulfed by a massive explosion. The German raider was scuttled and left to burn. This is, of course, a Cliff Notes version of the story. I have done a full video on Graf Spee, and will link that in the description for the longer form version of this story. Now, let's look at the wreck. There were quite a few pictures taken of the ship in the immediate aftermath of the scuttling, most from a film reel that you might have seen on YouTube. Graf Spee burned for a couple days after the sinking, while curious boats pulled up alongside. They would have seen a ship that looked mostly fine from the bow. The ship was low in the water, and the bridge was burnt and blackened. But the bow, at least, was mostly intact, aside from the funnel falling over to the side. The further back one sailed, however, the worse the damage got. There was the aforementioned funnel, of course. The fire damage grew worse too, with the secondary battery completely burnt out. The superstructure was a ruined mess. However, the worst damage came at the stern. Most of this was underwater, after being blown off the rest of the ship around the aft turret. That turret itself was basically destroyed. It's not the focus of most pictures you'll see, but there are a couple, showing the turret tilted up and away from the ship, with the barbette exposed, and the barrels gone. It's not a pretty sight, and a good demonstration of how effective a good scuttling can really be. Graf Spee was never going to sail again. This particular picture shows just how far up that barbette was thrown from the ship in stark detail. That said, as interesting as looking at the immediate aftermath is, I think there are more fascinating pictures, from an unexpected source at that. Instead of curious onlookers, You instead have the United States Navy to thank for these pictures. On January 29, 1940, USS Helena arrived in Montevideo on her shakedown cruise. The ostensibly neutral United States Navy was quite interested in the burnt-out hulk of Graf Spee. Helena's crew boarded the wreck and examined everything in detail. There are a surprising amount of surviving pictures from this examination. Some of them are even accompanied by hand-drawn diagrams of the damage, which are really fun to look at. From a historian's perspective, at least. There's also a good look at how the ship gradually settled into the bottom. Only a little over a month since her scuttling, and the secondary battery was already largely submerged. Water was even reaching the point of lapping at the anti-aircraft battery, which was mounted relatively high in the hull. One can imagine, looking at how high the water level is, how much was underwater. Helena's crew wasn't going to be spelunking in the lower decks for sure. The visitors were probably more interested in the upper levels anyway. While Langsdorff and his crew had disabled much of Spee's equipment, the rangefinders and fire directors remained aboard. Helena's crew went to great pains to record these pieces of equipment, as you could expect. There were few things as important to document as those were. Even if you do have some unintentional hilarity, when you look at a sailor climbing up on one of the directors. Other areas of interest included the damage the British had done to the ship. Here you can see a shell hole through the superstructure as an example. The notes from Helena say it was large enough to crawl through, presumably by a full-grown sailor. The bridge itself got the same amount of attention, and one of the most detailed diagrams at that. It's not exactly high art by any means, but does it really need to be? The diagram shows where everything is located and gives an idea of what everything was. Of course, from the most detailed diagram, we can move to one of the less detailed ones. Helena's crew took a picture of the collapsed stack with an accompanying diagram. There isn't very much here, either in the picture or the drawing. On the other hand, it is a nice look at the funnel, and the damage it sustained to collapse it as well. With that done, though, there's only one more picture and diagram set. It isn't the last picture of the wreck, as we'll see, but it is the last one to have a surviving diagram. For a certain value of surviving, as much of the writing has faded over the years. Nonetheless, between the diagram and the picture, we can make out what this mess of debris actually is. And that's a view aft from the surviving superstructure. Most of the ship, aft of the catapult, is underwater by this point. The catapult itself is recognizable and intact. But that's about it. Most notable, I think, is a look at the back of the aft turret. This is another angle we didn't see before, and shows how severe the damage was. The entire top was blown off, and the barrels were destroyed. All that's left is the frame of the turret, and whatever shattered debris remains of the internal mechanisms. That does round off the diagrams. There are a few more pictures from this visit to look at, however. These range from more superstructure shots like this one, to more of the weaponry. The next picture, meanwhile, is a top-down look into the open control platform on the bow. Furthermore, it gives an excellent idea of the visibility over the bow turret, which is, in stark contrast to the aft turret, perfectly fine, submergence and fire damage aside. Although the front side doesn't look quite as nice. As you can see here, the paint has been burnt off the barrels, and the bow is, while still technically above water, steadily sinking further into the bottom. It's completely awash at this point. That high water level is just as apparent looking at another smaller mount. This area is right around the funnel and is also mostly underwater, although it still looks better than some of the 20mm gun mounts. This one, as an example, was clearly burnt to a crisp. As for the gun itself, that's missing. Exactly what happened to it, I can't say with any certainty. You can see a similar level of roughness in the one interior shot that I've seen. This is inside the bridge tower, and is a mess as could be expected. Broken plating, fire damage, and loose wiring hanging from the ceiling. Remember, Spee was only there for about a month when this picture was taken. That's all damage from the scuttling, not the environment. Although that does round off the pictures from Helena. Before I move on, I'll make one final note. The salvage operation I mentioned from the early 2000s wasn't the only one. The British, through a front company, partially salvaged the wreck between 1942 and 1943. This was done mostly to take off any sensitive equipment, including a radar rangefinder in this case. While most of the wreck was salvaged above the waterline, some of it remained, until, eventually, everything rolled over and submerged. And that's a good point to move on and talk about what little there is on the current state of the wreck. Unfortunately, the condition of the wreck, in the modern day, is a bit harder to make out. I haven't found much in the way of information on that, aside from that salvage operation back at the start of the 21st century, which talked a big talk about bringing up the whole ship in pieces. As far as I'm aware, that didn't really go anywhere. Regardless, the best we have from that operation are some 3D images. As seen here, Graf Spee is, or was circa 2004, in rough shape. The remnants of the superstructure are collapsed next to the ship. You'll see an image from the same set as this one, with that tower resting upright and far away from the ship. That's contradictory, obviously, and would be weird, to say the least. I'm assuming that was done for artistic purposes, to demonstrate what it looked like on the surface, although that is rather misleading if you happen to stumble across it. As for the rest of the wreck, the bow turret is in decent enough condition, all things considered. The aft turret is invisible here, while the stern is broken clean off. However, that's about it. In spite of how shallow the wreck is, I've never found any pictures of what Graf Spee looks like underwater. I imagine it isn't good, but I can't say for sure. The currents are rough in the area, and visibility isn't great, so that's probably why there's little to work with. Drain the Oceans looked at the wreck as well, but they only really showed a 3D model, mostly in line with the salvage one. In any event, that brings us to the end of this video. The aforementioned salvage operation brought up some parts of the ship over the years. The main optical rangefinder, a couple secondary guns, and the eagle from her stern. That last piece is still intact, last I heard, but is also being kept under lock and key by the local government, in spite of various attempts to acquire it, to either blow up or melt down. For now, though, those bits and pieces on the surface are all we can see of Graf Spee's wreck. Before I finish, I will note one thing at the end here that I also noted in the Graf Spee video. Contrary to certain myths and legends, there is no real evidence the Argentinians used metal from Spee's wreck to make pistols. Forgotten Weapons has an excellent video on this topic, which I'll link in the description. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.